The snow came the next morning, almost a foot of it, soft and white, settling over the smoking ruins of what had been, the day before, ordinary suburban neighborhoods. If that snow had fallen just half a day earlier, there would have been no disaster at all. A grass fire cannot run across ground covered in snow. But the snow came 12 hours too late, after the fire had already done the unthinkable, after it had swept through subdivisions between Denver and Boulder and burned more than 1,000 homes to the ground in a single afternoon.
Oh, look at that. That's a live picture, dramatic images from Boulder, Colorado, where a massive wildfire is burning right now. So far, 2 entire cities have been ordered to evacuate.
This is the story of the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history. A firestorm that did not roar through a remote forest in the heat of summer, but tore through tidy suburban streets 2 days before the new year, in the dead of winter. Everything about this fire defies what we think we know about wildfires. We picture them in the mountains, in dense pine forest in July and August, threatening cabins and small towns at the edge of the wilderness.
And these fires are burning at higher level severities. They're burning at higher elevations.
The Marshall Fire was none of those things. It happened on December 30th, 2021. In Boulder County, Colorado, in the flat, developed land between the foothills and the cities, an area of master-planned subdivisions, shopping centers, a hotel, big box stores, the kind of comfortable suburban landscape where no one imagines a wildfire could reach them. The communities it struck, Superior and Louisville, were not rustic mountain villages. They were modern suburbs, full of recently built homes packed close together. And that, it turned out, was no protection at all. The fire did not need a forest. It found something else to burn. To understand how a suburb burns down 2 days before New Year's, you have to look at the months that came before. The Front Range of Colorado had just lived through its warmest 7-month stretch on record. An unusually wet spring had grown an abundance of grass across the open spaces between the towns. And then a hot, dry summer and an exceptionally dry autumn had cured all of that grass into tinder. Boulder County had slid into extreme drought, and critically, the snow that normally blankets the ground by late December simply had not come. It had been a near snowless late autumn and early winter, leaving the grasslands bare, brown, and bone dry, as flammable as they would be at the height of summer. The fuel for a catastrophe was lying across the landscape, and almost no one thought of it as a threat, because it was grass, not forest, and because it was winter. This distinction matters more than it might seem. When most people picture the boundary where wildfire threatens homes, what experts call the wildland-urban interface, they imagine houses tucked among tall pines, the classic mountain cabin scenario. But there is another kind of interface, far more common and far less feared, where neighborhoods simply back onto open grassland, prairie, or scrub. That is the landscape of the Front Range Plains and of countless suburban developments across the country. Grass seems harmless compared to a forest. It is low, it is thin, it looks like nothing. But on a dry, high wind day, grass is one of the most dangerous fuels there is, precisely because it carries fire so fast. A forest fire, for all its ferocity, often moves at a pace people can flee. A grass fire in a powerful wind can move faster than a car, racing across open ground and arriving at the edge of a subdivision with almost no warning. The very thing that made Superior and Louisville feel safe, that they were suburbs on the plains and not cabins in the woods, was an illusion. The grass was all the fuel the fire needed. The one thing that fuel needed was wind. And on December 30th, the wind arrived with a violence that turns a grass fire into a weapon. That morning, a powerful weather pattern set up over the Front Range, sending air rushing down the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains in what meteorologists call a downslope windstorm. The mechanism is the same one that produces the warm, violent Chinook winds Boulder is known for. As a strong upper-level disturbance forced air up and over the Continental Divide, that air came crashing down the far side of the mountains, and as it descended it compressed, accelerated, and dried out, heating up and losing what little humidity it had. By the time it reached the foothills and the plains beyond, it was a hot, parched, ferocious wind. Gusts roared across the foothills and out onto the plains at 70, 80, 100 miles an hour, with some measurements topping 115. This was not a breeze that might fan a fire. This was a hurricane-force wind, dry as dust, and it was doing two things at once. It was drying the grass even further by the hour, and it was ready to take any flame and hurl it across the landscape. Any spark in that wind would not start a fire. It would start an explosion. The spark came late that morning. Investigators would spend more than a year piecing together how it started, and the answer turned out to be unusual. The Marshall Fire was not one fire, but two separate ignitions that eventually merged into a single advancing front. One of them was traced to a smoldering fire on a private property, embers from an earlier burn that had never fully died and that flared back to life when the wind came up. The other was linked to a power line belonging to the state's largest utility. Hot particles thrown from the electrical equipment into the dry grass below. The two fires, born close together, joined and became one. The role of the utilities equipment would become the subject of public anger and lawsuits, part of a growing pattern across the West in which aging electrical infrastructure in extreme wind becomes the trigger for catastrophic fire. When it started, though, there were no towering flames, no obvious sign of the catastrophe to come. It was a grass fire. But the moment that wind got hold of it, everything changed. The fire took off across the open grassland faster than a person could run. Faster than crews could position themselves, pushed east by that screaming downslope gale toward the suburbs that lay in its path. What happened next happened with terrifying speed. Within a short time of the fire being spotted, it had crossed the open space and reached the town of Superior, several miles away, the flames driven across the grass so fast that the distance bought almost no time at all. And once it reached the edge of the neighborhoods, it did the thing that makes these wind-driven fires so lethal in developed areas. It stopped being a grass fire and became an urban firestorm, leaping from house to house directly. The wind carrying burning embers far ahead of the flame front and dropping them onto roofs and decks and fences deep inside the subdivisions. Homes did not catch, one at a time, from an approaching wall of flame. They ignited from the inside of the neighborhood out, embers finding any vulnerable spot: a wooden fence, a dry deck, a vent, a clogged gutter, one house lighting the next, entire blocks going up almost at once. A modern suburban neighborhood, it turned out, is full of fuel, the homes themselves, the fences, the cars, the landscaping, and packed tightly enough that once a few houses are burning in 100-mile-an-hour wind, there is very little anyone can do to stop the rest from following. Firefighters who arrived found themselves in an almost impossible situation. You cannot fight a fire like this the way you fight a normal structure fire, by surrounding it and putting water on it. The wind was too strong, the spread too fast, the embers flying too far ahead. In winds that powerful, water from a hose is torn apart and blown sideways before it reaches the flames. Crews were reduced to trying to pull people out and to defending what little they could, watching whole streets of homes burn that they had no way to save. Commercial buildings burned alongside the houses. A hotel went up. A shopping center burned. The fire did not discriminate between a family's home and a big box store. It took whatever was in its path, and its path was an entire developed landscape that had never been built with fire in mind. For the tens of thousands of people who lived in Superior and Louisville, the afternoon became a desperate scramble to get out. Around 37,000 people were ordered to evacuate, often with only minutes of warning, as the smoke rolled in and the sky turned an apocalyptic brown and the fire appeared at the end of their streets. Many had no idea a fire was even a possibility that morning. It was 2 days before New Year's, a windy winter day, nothing more. Then the smoke was at their door. People grabbed children, pets, whatever they could carry, and fled into gridlocked roads, the wind so strong it rocked their cars, the air thick with smoke and flying embers, the visibility dropping to almost nothing. Some left with only the clothes they were wearing. Shoppers ran out of stores as the flames approached, abandoning their carts. Drivers caught in the chaos left their cars on the road. Parents raced to schools and daycares to pull out their kids. It was a chaotic, terrifying flight from a fire that was moving faster than the human mind expects fire to move, in a place where no one had ever rehearsed for it, on a day no one had thought to fear. Thousands of pets and other animals could not be reached in time and were lost in the fire, a quiet grief layered under the larger one. By the time the wind finally began to ease that evening, the damage was almost beyond belief for a single afternoon. More than 1,000 homes had been destroyed, along with businesses, a hotel, and a shopping center. The final count came to over 1,000 structures lost, with hundreds more damaged. In less than 12 hours, the Marshall Fire had become the most destructive wildfire in the entire history of Colorado, measured by the number of structures it consumed, surpassing fires that had burned far more acres but destroyed far fewer buildings. 2 people lost their lives. That the death toll was not far higher, given how fast the fire moved through such a populated area, is something close to a miracle owed to a frantic, large-scale evacuation that got most people out just ahead of the flames. And then, the next morning, the snow fell. It was a brutal irony that no one who lived through it will ever forget. A heavy snowfall moved in on the night of December 31st and into New Year's Day, blanketing the burn area, snuffing out the last of the flames, covering the blackened foundations in white. The same weather that, had it arrived a day sooner, would have made the fire impossible, instead arrived just in time to fall on the ashes. The grasslands that had been bone-dry tinder the day before were now under snow. The fire was out. But more than 1,000 families no longer had homes to return to. What the fire left behind was not a clean slate either. When a fire burns through a modern neighborhood, it does not just consume wood. It burns plastics, electronics, vehicles, paints, and the countless synthetic materials of a contemporary home, and the ash it leaves is laced with toxic compounds. The fire knocked out power to water systems, and as the pressure dropped, contaminants were drawn into the drinking water distribution lines, forcing warnings and a long process of testing and decontamination before the water was safe again. Even homes that survived, that were left standing amid the destruction, were not necessarily livable. Researchers who studied the aftermath found that wildfire smoke had driven harmful chemical compounds deep into surviving houses, where they lingered for weeks, and that people living near the burned areas reported headaches, sore throats, and coughs long after the flames were gone. The disaster did not end when the fire went out. For many, it simply changed into a slower, quieter form. The recovery revealed yet another cruelty. When survivors began the long process of rebuilding, many discovered that their insurance, the coverage they had paid for faithfully for years, was nowhere near enough to rebuild what they had lost, as construction costs had risen far beyond the policy limits they had set. By some assessments, only a small fraction of the families who lost homes in the Marshall Fire had enough insurance to fully replace them. People who had done everything right, who had insured their homes and never missed a payment, found themselves unable to rebuild the life the fire had taken. It was a slow, grinding second disaster that played out over years, long after the cameras had left. The deepest lesson of the Marshall Fire is that the old rules about where and when wildfires happen no longer hold. Fire season on the Front Range and in much of the West is no longer confined to summer. A warm, dry, snowless stretch in December can leave the ground every bit as ready to burn as August. And the danger is not limited to homes tucked into the forest. Any neighborhood that backs onto open grassland, and there are countless such neighborhoods across the country, shares the exposure that Superior and Louisville discovered that day. Because grass on a high wind day carries fire faster than a forest does, straight into the suburbs. The Marshall Fire took a danger that people thought belonged to mountain cabins and summer, and it dropped it onto ordinary suburban families 2 days before the new year. So here is what I want to ask you. Think about your own home and the open ground anywhere near it, the field behind the subdivision, the dry grass along the highway, the greenbelt at the edge of the neighborhood. On the worst possible day, a screaming dry wind and months without rain, could a fire run across that ground and into your street? And here is the harder question the Marshall Fire forces, the one its survivors learned too late. If your home burned to the ground tomorrow, would the insurance you are paying for actually be enough to rebuild it? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to understand how the safe assumptions we live by are quietly becoming dangerous, stay with me, because that is the thread running through nearly every modern disaster.